No, Matt Walsh. White people bad. White people very bad when it comes to the institution of African slavery in the antebellum South and in the states that would eventually become the Confederate States of America that existed for one purpose and one purpose only, to continue in perpetuity for all time the institution of African slavery based on white supremacy. This is going to be a quick video response to Matt Walsh's video, which came out the other day, in which he goes off on a tear because educated, civilized human beings here in the United States are angry that Trump and his Department of Education and all the cronies that work with it are trying to go into places like the Smithsonian in order to revise American history, in order to make America great again, which we know is just code word for white supremacy and bringing back a time when we glorified the South, the antebellum South, the slaveocracy, and of course, the Confederate States of America. Now, what Matt Walsh tries to do in this video is what Candace Owens in a PragerU video did, and I talked about that in a previous video that I made, where whenever you bring up the horror and the atrocity of the system of African slavery in the United States, they like to point to slavery all over the world. How it wasn't just white people who created slavery, how Arabs and the Barbary pirates enslaved Europeans, how the word slave comes from the word Slav, which are Eastern Europeans. And to all of that, I've said time and time again, I hate this argument, and it almost makes me want to say, so what? And I have to be very careful with that because that tends to take away from the horrors of all these other forms of slavery, which is never my intent. Slavery, in all of its iterations, in all the examples of slavery around the world that have existed since the beginning of time, are horrible, horrible institutions. Not one instance of slavery in one part of the world or one people of another doesn't take away from the horrors of another institution of slavery in another part of the world. They are all equally horrible, and the fact that slavery still exists today is another horrible stain on humanity, and we need to do everything we can to stop it. But when people like Matt Walsh make those videos, or when people come to my small YouTube channel and post comments about the Barbary pirates and people enslaving whites, I say, how does that take away from the system of white supremacy that existed in the antebellum South, in the early Republic antebellum South, that culminated in the Confederacy? How does that take away from how white people, in this case, white people then bad, no argument, no question about it, how does it take away from their enslavement of people of African descent, which was based entirely on white supremacy? And I've talked about this before. I'm going to talk about it again in today's video. The system of African slavery was and had to be based on white supremacy in order for the jurist in the South to make it make sense, to allow it to exist. That's what I'm going to talk about in a second. But the point is, when Matt Walsh points to European slavery, to indigenous American slavery before the arrival of Europeans, I again say, so what? How does that take away from the system of African slavery in the United States? How does that alleviate the responsibility of whites in the United States for creating and maintaining and sustaining that system, and eventually creating a nation that was created for the sole purpose of continuing the institution of African slavery? You see, we can acknowledge no one in the academic world who talks about the horrors of African slavery in the United States discards or argues that slavery everywhere else around the world was a horrible thing. Of course it was a horrible thing. But again, we're talking about American history here. I'm not talking about the history of the Barbary pirates. I'm not talking about the history of Europe. I'm looking at American history. And in American history, when it comes to the system of African slavery, yes, Matt Walsh, white people bad. White people were very bad. Are white people today bad? Mostly no. And I would hope that we could all come to the point where we learn to live amongst each other, even in spite of the horrors that have been committed in the past. But we're only going to get over the horrors committed in the past if we accept them for what they were and we accept responsibility for them. And glorifying the past, the Confederacy, the slaveocracy, is never going to get us there, because the fact that the system was based on white supremacy, the fact that the system was based on people believing in the inferiority of people of African descent, is the reason that we had systemic racism long past the Reconstruction era, even into today. Because while slavery was abolished, those racist ideas, the racist foundation of slavery didn't end when the 13th Amendment was passed. Those people didn't just simply disappear. The jurists, the judges, the attorneys, the lawyers, the people who made the laws, who held these racist values which they were raised under, they didn't just shut that off when the 13th Amendment was ratified. So yes, white people bad. And again, today, I'm going to look at an inquiry into the laws of Negro slavery in the United States of America by Thomas R.R. Cobb. And for those of you new to the channel, Thomas R.R. Cobb was known as the James Madison of the Confederacy because he was instrumental in the writing of the Confederate Constitution in the same way that James Madison was instrumental in writing the U.S. Constitution. He was a very famous jurist from Georgia, and in fact, this book, this is a corpus of antebellum slave law from all of the slaveholding states. This was so valuable and it was so highly regarded that it's even cited by many of the state supreme courts of the slaveholding states in the antebellum South. Alabama's an example. They cite the record of this book. So it was well known and it was used. And one of the things that Thomas Cobb does is when he talks about what is a slave in the introduction to the chapter on slave laws in the United States, he goes on to say that slavery is the natural condition of the African, of people of the African race. And he then tries to explain why this is so. And I want to get into that today. He's going to talk about the law of nature, right? And what it means according to him with the law of nature. He says, we adopt as the law of nature when applied to man and his intercourse with his fellow man. So what is the relationship between men and men? What does the law of nature say of how we can relate to our other human beings? That obligation which reason and conscience impose so as to shape his course as to attain the greatest happiness and arrive at the greatest perfection of which his nature is susceptible. Consequently, whatever interferes with the attainment of this happiness and perfection does violence to the law of his nature, and whatever promotes or is consistent therewith is sanctioned by the law of his nature. In this view, natural rights depend entirely upon the nature of the possessor, not of the right, for it is the former and not the latter that determines the question of right. Hence, to speak of the natural right to personal liberty is unphilosophical until the previous question is settled, that such liberty will conduce the happiness and perfection of the possessor. So what he's saying is, the law of nature says that we can do to our fellow man whatever benefits that individual. And we say that there is a natural right to liberty. There isn't a natural right to liberty. That right is dependent on whether the possessor would benefit from that right. So what he's going to go on to say, if you haven't figured it out, is that white people, their condition is bettered by liberty, whereas people of African descent, liberty it actually goes against their nature, and being enslaved betters them, is better for them, and therefore slavery of African people does not go against the law of nature. He goes on, in this view, is Negro slavery consistent with the law of nature? We confine the inquiry to Negro slavery because, upon the principles already established, it is undoubtedly true that the enslavement by one man or one race of another man or another race, physically, intellectually, and morally their equals, is contrary to the law of nature because it promotes not their happiness and tends not to their perfection. So now look what he's doing. He's saying that white people cannot enslave other white people. We're only going to look at white people enslaving black people because since white people are equal to each other, there is no benefit to be derived from me enslaving another white person because they cannot learn anything from me. They cannot get anything from me. They cannot be bettered by enslavement to me. However, if there is inequality of races, if Caucasians are superior to Africans and enslaving Africans can better their condition through being enslaved to Caucasians, then it does not go against the law of nature. And he then goes on for many pages in the introduction to explain how black people are inferior, how the greatest thing, the greatest condition for people of African descent is to be enslaved to Caucasians. And therefore, because enslavement betters their condition, it is sanctioned by the law of nature and requires no positive law for it to exist, meaning you don't have to have on a state code book, you can have slaves, because slavery of the black people by white people is natural, right? And that is what justified slavery in the antebellum United States, from the early republic all the way up into the Civil War and to the 13th Amendment with the abolishment of slavery. So all of this argument of slavery all over the world, yeah, slavery everywhere is terrible. Every single group of human beings has done terrible, terrible things. Why? Because we're terrible, terrible creatures, and we do crap, and that's just what we do, and it's horrible. But we've come so far that through education and, enlightenment and going over these things and accepting responsibility for it, we can overcome the vices and sins of our past and make a better future. But when people like Matt Walsh try and deflect and try and take away blame from white people for African slavery in the United States by pointing to slavery everywhere else in the world, well, what does that have to do with the price of tea in China? How does slavery anywhere else take away from white people bad when it comes to slavery in the United States of America? It is written by them. I didn't make it up. I've done now 30 some odd videos going to antebellum slave laws and slave codes, showing you court decisions where they talk about the inferiority of black people, where they talk about how the natural condition of Africans is to be enslaved by Caucasians. So white people, bad when it comes to African slavery in the United States. It doesn't matter that slavery existed all over the world. We're not talking about all over the world. We're talking about the United States history, the history of the country in which we live in. There is not a single person trying to erect a monument to a Barbary pirate enslaver of Caucasians in the center of a city in the United States. However, there are people trying to erect monuments to Confederates, to enslavers, to people who owned other human beings, raped other human beings that they considered to be their property. There is an effort in the United States today to raise monuments to those people. The second someone tries to erect a monument to a Barbary pirate captain who enslaved white Europeans, then Matt, I will be the first to post a video and object to it and try and educate people on the horrors of the Barbary slave trade. However, I'm a scholar of antebellum slave laws and slave codes. I understand how horrible the slaveocracy in the system was, and that's what I'm trying to do here on YouTube. And to answer the question, yes, white people bad. The system of African slavery in the United States was based entirely on white supremacy, and that was the foundation of the slaveocracy. That was the baseline. That was what held up the society of Gone with the Wind and the Confederate States of America. So the fact that anyone can glorify this today is absurd and upsetting. And if we allow groups like the Department of Education and Trump's cronies to go into the Smithsonian and remove the fact that slavery in the United States was based on white supremacy, then we are rewriting history and we are never going to overcome the sins of our past. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Remember, as always, like, subscribe, share, and I'll see you for the next one.